Life panel. Today's hearing is an update on unaccompanied housing, and we're going to focus on that in the first set of panel, and then we're going to talk more about military housing privatization initiative with our second panel. I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today. I hope this hearing provides an opportunity for our members to have a productive to their questions. Today we are addressing an issue that is critical to the quality of life for service members and their families, the state of military housing. This is an issue that goes beyond party lines and demands our attention and action. Our men and women in uniform have put their life on the line to protect our freedom. They and their families make countless sacrifices for our nation. We owe it to these individuals they have access to safe, comfortable, and affordable housing. Unfortunately, the reality of military housing is often far from that, and that is our focus for today. Last week, the Government Accountability Office published a report detailing deplorable and frankly inexcusable conditions of our unaccompanied housing for junior service members. Sewage overflow, water quality issues, rodent infestations, mold, broken air conditioning units, and sweltering heat, and others, all have been found in these facilities. Facilities that service members are expected to required to live in. I just want to say, I was a base commander at Ramstein and at Offutt Air Force Base. If I would have had these conditions in any of our barracks, I would have got fired. One of the things that we want to know today, where is the accountability at with these barracks? Has anybody been held accountable? And what are we going to do to get this right and get it fixed? I don't recall the standards being this way when I got out in 2014. Something has happened, and we need to put our finger on it and get it fixed. So we cannot allow this situation to persist. It is an issue not only of justice and dignity, but also of military readiness. When our service members are preoccupied with their health and safety, they cannot focus on their mission. A few years ago, we saw similar conditions in private family military housing. Families dealt with long delays in repair and maintenance requests, or requests that were not responded to at all. Children were getting sick from mold and lead paint, and members feared retribution from private companies if they complained to their command. This situation required extensive congressional action to make improvements to these conditions. The department and individual services have continued to neglect the oversight and management these projects require. They have failed to provide the housing that service members need and deserve. I believe what we're going to hear next will prove this. This matter must be addressed. We must demand greater accountability from the Department of Defense. Today you will hear from two panels. The first panel is an expert from GAO that will share the results of a recent audit of unaccompanied housing facilities, including issues related to funding and oversight. In the second panel, we will hear from DoD officials responsible for housing policy. They will describe the current status of privatized military housing. Additionally, they will address the implementation of the statutorily required provisions, ensuring the quality of this housing. I would now like to welcome our witnesses for the first panel. We have Elizabeth Field. She's a director with GAO's Defense Capabilities and Management Team. Before doing so, I want to yield to Ms. Escobar, who's filling in for our ranking member. But before I do, this is so important. Just to go off script a little bit, we have a recruiting and a retention problem in our military right now. Quality of life isn't the only factor. There are other factors, but quality of life is one. And when you talk to parents with an 18-year-old son or daughter, and you ask them, do you want their son or daughter to serve? When they hear stuff like these barracks, it inhibits folks from wanting their 18-year-old sons or daughters to join. If you're an 18-year-old, you see this, it's an inhibitor. We got to get this right. And with that, I yield to Ms. Escobar.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank you for your focus on this issue at the hearing today. And I would like to associate myself with your remarks on just how unacceptable the current situation remains. We know that especially for young families, this is a critical component of their quality of life. We also know that part of our recruitment challenge is the fact that it's not just the service member who serves, but the entire family. And so we have to make sure that we are upholding our commitment to the highest potential standard of quality of life, and that this discussion is a critical component to that. I have the incredible privilege of serving on behalf of my community, El Paso, Texas, home to Fort Bliss, a critical key amazing asset for our national defense, and I have had some of these same concerns for some time now. Unfortunately, I was not surprised by the GAO report issued this month on military housing. And so our responsiveness is going to be key to continuing to see improvements. And I know that there are many, not just here on this dais, not just in Congress, not just active duty service members, but I know there are members of the administration who also find this absolutely unacceptable. And I look forward to a path forward, and I'm eager to getting to these two panels. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Escobar. Ms. Field, you'll have the opportunity to present your testimony, and each member will have an opportunity to question you for about 5 minutes. Your written comments and statements will be made part of the hearing record. And with that, Ms. Yield, you may make your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Bacon, Congresswoman Escobar, and members of the panel. It's an honor to be here today. Since March of 2018, GAO has made more than 80 recommendations to the Defense Department to improve both privatized family housing and government-owned unaccompanied housing. The most recent of these recommendations come from a report that we issued just last week focusing on the condition of unaccompanied housing, which I will refer to as barracks. As you know, military barracks are used to house our most junior enlisted service members, many of them teenagers fresh out of high school. Unfortunately, because of this, we found that many, although not all, department officials have chosen not to obtain their input about the quality of their housing. According to these officials, this demographic group is so unreliable in terms of completing surveys or replying to email or telephone inquiries that it isn't worth trying to solicit their opinion. Other officials told us that the condition of barracks is not a key factor in military retention and therefore doesn't merit inclusion as a topic in already lengthy surveys. What we learned, however, is that these service members have a lot to say and are eager for someone to listen. Over the course of 5 months, we visited 10 military installations where we held discussion groups with service members living in the barracks. We promised them that their input mattered, that we needed to hear from them because Congress wanted to hear from them. So today, because this panel is all about quality of life, I would like to honor that commitment to them and share what we heard and saw about quality of life in the barracks. As I recount our discussions, I invite you to turn your attention to the slides projected, which document some of the substandard conditions we observed. One of the most common complaints we heard was about mold. There is a leak and black mold in the shower, one resident told us, and maintenance still won't fix it, no matter how often it's reported. Another resident said, mold in the barracks makes you feel expendable, like we don't matter. A number of the facilities we visited had broken HVAC systems. One Marine said, I often wake up at night, sweating from the heat, itching from bed bugs, and feeling like I am suffocating. And this from an airman. It can be really challenging to come in from a day of working where you may be exposed to the cold or to the heat all day and then get no relief from the temperatures when you return to your room. Although DoD standards call for barracks rooms to have at least a kitchenette, we found that none of the military service standards reflects that requirement. Not surprisingly, therefore, we saw barracks where residents had access to only a small fridge and microwave, or in one case, only a small microwave. They told us it made it hard for them to follow a healthy diet. For example, one resident told us it is challenging to meet physical readiness requirements when the only option for meals are frozen food that can be microwaved and fast food. Perhaps some of the most troubling statements we heard had to do with safety. It is difficult to feel safe in the barracks, one sailor told us. The doors don't work. Anyone can access our rooms, recounted a Marine. Sexual assault happens in the barracks more than people think, one service member said. In every one of our discussion groups, the topic of mental health came up. These are just a few of the statements we heard. It's depressing to come home to a dark box after work. I feel cramped and like the walls are closing in, and that causes me anxiety and stress. The barracks feel like living in a rundown motel or in a prison. These problems are unfortunately not dissimilar from the ones we have observed and documented in privatized family housing. The only real difference is that the Defense Department has felt more pressure in recent years to fix the problems in family housing than it has to fix the problems with barracks. I appreciate that today's hearing should help rectify that. History tells us, though, that ensuring better housing for our service members and their families will take sustained oversight and attention. 20 years ago, GAO reported many similar problems with the condition of barracks. 10 years ago, in a report to Congress, DoD lauded the progress it had made in modernizing its barracks program. It stated that by increasing military construction funding, introducing new designs offering more privacy and amenities, and directing more maintenance funding to barracks, it had brought the modernization program closer to completion. The department also promised that military barracks would be adequately maintained over the long term. Obviously, that didn't happen. We believe that the recommendations in our report, if fully implemented, will put the department on a better footing to address this substantial challenge, but it will take years to reverse the chronic neglect and underfunding we uncovered. I appreciate this panel's focus on the problem and hope that it is the beginning of many conversations about how the military can do better by its most junior active duty members. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Field. When you see these pictures, it's disgusting, unacceptable, cannot go on. During your time and during your GO's time investigating this, was there a sense of accountability in the services, whether it's at the Pentagon level or the installation commanders? Does anybody take ownership of this?
Excuse me. I think that changed to a certain extent over the course of our audit as we began to do more interviews and site visits. I think people knew GAO was there and maybe they should start paying attention. But I will tell you what was one of the most troubling things we observed during our audit was that the Office of the Secretary of Defense, which is supposed to oversee the barracks programs, give guidance to the military services, very much had a hands-off approach to this topic. When we asked them some basic questions at the beginning of our audit about how many barracks there were, whether they were not complying with standards, how many service members live there, they couldn't tell us. I think that's changing, but you're absolutely right that it has been an issue.
Was there at least a sense at the installation level that the commander of that installation had ownership of this, or was it's not my problem?
I think at the installation level, there was more of a sense of ownership. We spoke to a number of installation commanders who, frankly, told us that they felt sick about the conditions that their junior enlisted service members were living in. They often recounted facing sort of impossible choices between where to put limited funding. So yes, at the installation level, I think there was more accountability.
So how have conditions in unaccompanied housing been able to deteriorate over time? And what has prevented the department from paying adequate attention to this housing and making improvements? And I note that for every presidential budget on DoD, Congress has put more money in. So I don't see how we can blame it on funds. We have actually plussed up DoD's presidential requests. So I'm curious, what is the story? How did this happen?
Well, you're right that Congress has, in many cases, given funding to the services when they haven't asked for funding for barracks. It might not have been the entirety of what they needed, though, and that is because we found in our audit that a lot of times, even though installations know they need funding for constructing new barracks, they don't feel comfortable requesting that funding because they know it won't compete well against other requirements, and so they don't put those requests forward. It really is a matter, though, of chronic underfunding at the DoD level, not on Congress's part. So what happens is facilities need to be maintained, upkept, as any facility does. But the department, we have reported previously, tends to only fund to about 80% of sustainment needs. And the facilities that most often lose out are things like barracks. Eventually, if you don't fund sustainment enough, you're going to need to build an entirely new barracks, which means you need new MILCON, military construction funding. And eventually, if you don't do that, you're going to have to spend money on basic allowance for housing to get service members to live in the economy because you just can't find a place for them to live. So I think it's a combination of that chronic underfunding and neglect, but also that lack of accountability. And this is just the last point I'll make. I know I'm out of time, but I think it's important because it strikes to the heart of your question. I think there has been a cultural perspective within the department that, part of being in the military is toughing it out, and this is just going to get them ready for the military. And unfortunately, I think that has gotten us in part to where we are today.
So what I'm hearing to a degree is when you buy a new car, if you maintain it, do the oil changes, spend smaller amounts of money to maintain it, you keep the car for a longer time. If you don't, you have to pay a lot more money to replace it. And what I'm hearing is we're not doing the normal maintenance to maintain these, and then we're having to put a lot more money in. It's penny wise, pound foolish is what I'm hearing. Am I hearing you right?
Yeah, you said it better than I did. Absolutely, that's right.
I'm a farm kid. That's what we do. So if you had one or two key recommendations right now to make this better, what do you recommend?
So I think in a time of limited resources, what the department needs to do is gather the information it needs to make more strategic decisions about where to put limited resources. That means knowing what condition the barracks are in. They don't know that right now. Knowing how much they're spending on things like basic allowance for housing so they can do a more informed cost-benefit analysis. It means reevaluating policies about who is required to live in the barracks and how you make exceptions to those policies. It means reconsidering the barracks manager position. So there's a lot. Our hope is, and this is one of our final recommendations, that the department develop a joint strategy so the services can learn from one another, so that standards can be put in place that are consistent to try to get behind this problem. But as you pointed out, we have 31 recommendations, so there's a lot the department needs to do.
Thank you very much. With that, I recognize Ms. Escobar for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank you so much for your work. And the component of the impact on mental health is something that really struck me, and it made me recall a hearing that we had last Congress on the Military Personnel Subcommittee about suicides, active duty member suicide and veteran suicide. And I will never forget one of our experts, and I wish I could recall his name in this moment, but a psychiatrist who said, you know, you've got to think about this in a different way. Many of our service members, it's not that they come in suffering with chronic depression or even have had suicide ideation before, but so much of this is rooted in environment. And he said, your job, Congress, is really to think about the environment and the impact it has on mental health. And it was just such I think, a profound realization for me in terms of not just how much more significant our obligation is around environment, but the impact of chronic underfunding and these chronic issues can have on our service members. And as an example, at Fort Bliss, we have some transient barracks that, honestly, in comparison to what we saw, there's no comparison. However, the HVAC system was so outdated. And in El Paso, we struck a record this year of about 3 months of 100+ degree temperatures, which had never happened before in the history of our weather tracking. And our transient barracks just could not sustain that even under the best of conditions. And as we kind of pulled the thread on that, we learned that it was a priority. It's just in terms of the context of so many other priorities fell further down the list. And we ended up making the decision to fund this out of our community project funding requests, which took a huge chunk of our funding for the community, but it was critical and important for the installation. My question to you is, and thank you for the recommendations, aside from me, for example, as the member of Congress who was, frequently going on site, visiting these barracks, wanting to keep direct eyes on it, if we could do one thing, the most important thing in our oversight function, would it be, for example, making easier surveys that are online through an app? Maybe you already do that. Or are there others, is there one strategy for us to have better eyes on this?
So it's hard to pick because there are so many problems, and this might sound like a sort of a cop-out, but it's not. And that is, if we don't see the department implement all 31 of our recommendations in a meaningful and timely manner, I would encourage you to consider putting those recommendations into legislation to make them statutorily required. That is something that has happened with privatized family housing, and I think that has been effective. I will note that the department concurred with most of our recommendations, but in some cases there were partial concurrences and statements that they've already implemented the recommendations, and so they're good. They're not good. So focusing on full and prompt implementation of our recommendations would be my recommendation.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. And then I do want to follow up on the surveys because it is a problem when the users of an asset don't participate in helping evaluate it, and we have less than a minute. What can we do to improve surveys? Because those are critical.
Well, the importance is to survey in the first place. So we found that only 2 of the services were even bothering to survey barracks residents about their satisfaction with housing, so the remaining 2 need to do it. We also found that none of the services routinely inquire and ask barracks residents how the barracks conditions impact their decision to re-enlist, which is a DoD requirement. So we have recommendations for them to do that. I will note that I think it's the Navy and Marine Corps, is that correct? Navy and Marine Corps that are the ones that are surveying, and they have developed a number of interesting ways to try to get their responses up. So I would encourage you to ask the next panel, particularly the Navy representative, how they've done that, because they have been successful.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Ms. Strickland from Washington.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Field, thank you so much for your testimony. I do appreciate it. I represent Joint Base Lewis McChord, one of the largest military installations on the West Coast. The housing challenges in the barracks aren't as severe, but there are still challenges we have. So much of our conversation today has been about resources. So I don't know if you all have had this discussion, but if we were to bring our barracks up to what I call safe, habitable, something that doesn't look run down or uninhabitable like we saw on these slides, what would the price tag be for that?
So that's a great question. It's one that we tried to answer through our audit. Bottom line is we don't know a total figure, in part because the department itself does not know how much it has been spending on barracks, whether it is, particularly if it is maintenance funding. But I can give you one statistic that might be helpful in terms of even getting a ballpark. In, I think it was 2022, the Air Force did submit a report to Congress in which it stated that it estimated it had about a $3.6 billion backlog just in terms of maintenance and upkeep of its existing barracks. And it would cost about $1 billion to newly construct some barracks that it needed. That's one service. It's not the biggest service, so that should give you some sense of scope here.
Right, no, and I appreciate that, and I know that, you know, in this committee, we often have conversations about chronic underfunding, but until we put a dollar amount to it, it doesn't have context. And I say that because, as you know, in Congress, there's often a push-pull between, let's just arbitrarily cut defense by 10%, and then there are people who want to plus it up more. And so I think that having a specific dollar amount to talk about what it's going to take to bring our barracks up to par, in addition to any new capital investments we need, gives us a more realistic place to start. I want to talk a bit about privatization. I know that with the family military housing, it did not turn out to be the silver bullet that we thought it would. Private developers have to make money, and I know that the business model for them isn't panning out. And so can you talk a bit about the challenges that the services have shared with you about initiatives to privatize the barracks?
So privatization is a tricky question because I think one of the things we've learned from this audit is whether it's government-owned or privatized, if you don't pay attention, if you don't fund, you're going to end up with poor living conditions. We did tour some privatized barracks, particularly in San Diego, and I have to be honest, they were in amazing condition. They were, way ahead of some of the government-owned barracks. Privatization, though, is not a silver bullet, and that is because, particularly for the population living in the barracks, it's not as easy as it was for family housing. For example, OMB scoring can be an issue because it essentially commits the government to a financial obligation, and so scoring can be problematic. This is a population that moves around more often than families, and so if you have barracks that are privatized barracks that might be left for months at a time. If someone goes off on a training mission, that's a problem. There's also issues related to unit cohesion and the fact that this is a younger population who are new to the military. So there are a lot of things to work out, legally related, funding related. It could actually cost more. It's a difficult policy question.
All right, and I would say, finally, can you talk about, well, you talked a bit about this. Where do you think it makes more sense to privatize the barracks versus just having them government run? Because to your point, it's not necessarily a silver bullet, but I do think that we have to use every possible tool available to make sure we're doing this. And the comment I want to make was, I think about how parents would feel if they went to a dormitory to drop off their kids at the university, and if some of those pictures existed, hell would be raised. And so I want to make sure that we are treating these barracks for the people who are serving the same way we would treat parents dropping their kids off at college.
Well, I agree. As the mother of a 17-year-old who's 1 year away from college, you're absolutely right. I think your question was, where would privatization make sense? Two thoughts on that. One, the department is on the hook to deliver a report to Congress on overall joint approach to privatization. That was due in July of this year. The department has not delivered it. We could not get any clear information from the department on when it will be delivered, so I think if this committee could push the department to complete that report, that would be helpful. The other note I will make is that I think some installations have been successful with privatization for some of the slightly more senior service members, so E5s, E6, maybe E4, that might make more sense.
All right, thank you very much. And as we talked earlier, we have a challenge with recruiting. Word of mouth is very, very strong. And so if you want to address some of these quality of life issues, housing is a basic need and it cannot be substandard. But I think solving the problem means coming up with a dollar amount and not being afraid to say it's a lot of money. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Strickland. I read that we had, let me get the number here, that we had $137 billion of maintenance backlog. Does that jive with the number you have?
Yes, that is what we have reported, and I should note that is a probably likely an underestimate.
Thank you. With that, I'll recognize Ms. Kiggins from Virginia. She represents large naval installations.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I represent Virginia's 2nd Congressional District, so Virginia Beach, Hampton Roads area, large Navy and veteran population. I can't imagine how frustrating it was just to visit those barracks. I know on barracks tours in my district, I have left almost in tears. It's hard to watch. As a veteran, Navy spouse, Navy mom. I mean, I think of my kids and their friends, and I put my staff in my minivan the first weekend I could and drove them down to Hampton Roads and said, look around and think about, we talked about the college campuses, but think about the dorms there. And I've done lots of dorm tours with my high school kids, and then think about the conditions that we're asking these guys to live in. So I know we've mentioned recruitment, retention, but I mean, this is absolutely directly correlated to those issues. It hurts my heart when I hear other Navy and military parents say, I can't recommend this job to my kids for these reasons. So we have to do better. I know that, as a nurse practitioner, housing is certainly a component of healthcare. So when I think of nutrition, I think of I want, troops that have good physical readiness, good mental health, all of the things we talk about routinely here in Congress. Housing is certainly a component of that. So we've got to get it right. You said, chronic neglect and underfunding. I think that was kind of a perfect summary of what's wrong with this. And you talked about base leadership and how they, the requests for money weren't there. I mean, I got so angry with our base leadership because they didn't put in the request. They're busy warfighting. They're busy training. I get it, but I think it's our job, and we talked about oversight a little bit, but to pester them. Hey, what do you need? The deadline's coming up. What do you need? I want to put money in for you. We got $0 for NAS Oceana this past year. And only 49% of our housing is livable. 49%. That means 51% is not livable. And when I say livable, that's even questionable. When we went and we saw the conditions that looked eerily similar to some of the pictures you posted. So we have to do better. I know our defense budget is limited. We just had a brief discussion on privatization. I've seen some of the good things we've done at Norfolk. You talked about scoring. Maybe we need to change that scoring, the way we're doing scoring, so that we can allot for that housing money to be going towards privatization. We can't do it all in the defense budget. I certainly want to prioritize warfighting. So we got to think outside the box here. So, I know you said there was some things that you were privatization some concerns, but I mean, do you think that's a direction we should be pursuing? I personally think it's a direction we're pursuing, but you're the expert.
I have so many thoughts based on what you said, but GAO has in the past recommended that DoD explore and examine privatization more closely as a possible option. What came out of that were service-specific strategies that you really couldn't use them to inform policy decision-making, which is why we are really looking forward to that DoD report, which is overdue. Certainly, I think that is an option that should be explored. I don't, from the GAO perspective, want to make a policy call, but absolutely there are benefits to privatization as well as there are cons. But as I said, the facilities I toured that were privatized were really impressive. Can I make one note about Oceana, because I think it's important, and about Navy in particular, and I'm sure you're aware of this. Condition scores 0 to 100 for every facility or every barracks. The one in Oceana that we've looked at has a score of 12 out of 100. That said, for 3 fiscal years in a row, the Navy requested $0 for new military construction for barracks. In one installation, one other Navy installation, the installation did put forward a request for funding for new barracks for 10 years in a row and never got it funded. So that is, I think, in part why installation commanders are throwing up their hands and giving up.
Yeah, well, I think it's our job in Congress to educate them. I mean, they change every 2 to 3 years. They are focused on things that need to be focused on, getting that mission done. So it's our job to say, hey, we want to get you money, help us with how to do that. In the DoD accountability piece, I mean, I think, Assistant Secretary Berger has been wonderful. She's come down a couple times, so I've really enjoyed working with her. I don't know if we need to, you talked about the Department of Defense was kind of a little less clear, so putting some just people in place to make sure there is that accountability, in addition to members of Congress doing our job as well. And then the only other comment I would have is that, I think of other apartment complexes. Who's building these things initially? I know we have one at NAS, or at Naval Station Norfolk, that $80 million, and it's less than 20 years old, covered in black mold. I mean, it's on the demo list. That's another thing. We need to increase funding for demolition. I'm sick of looking at these buildings that we're not going to be able to restore, but just making sure that we are building quality products. I think we are not building quality products, and that's leading to a lot of these issues. And I'm out of time, but I'd go on for about another hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kagan. I'd like to piggyback on something you said, because there's a point you're making, we're making, that like commanders at these installations worry about fighting wars and combat readiness and all that, and that is so true. But as an installation commander, you got folks that they're in charge of the installation, civil engineering, and all these facilities. And then you also, at the headquarters, you have 2-star and 3-star level leadership that's supposed to be overseeing this. I would just like to submit again, yes, we got to win wars. We got to make sure we're ready to fight and win. But it's also our responsibility to make sure these facilities are serving our men and women who are there. And so this comes back to a leadership issue, in my view. I just wanted to add in, because it's, so somebody took their eyes off the ball here, bottom line. So with that, Ms. Jacobs from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Field, great to see you. I first want to talk about this funding of barracks. As you mentioned, barracks are competing against other facilities funding. The FY22 NDAA included a provision that required the military to make investments in the improvement of unaccompanied military housing using FSRM funds in an amount equal to 5% of the estimated replacement cost of the total inventory of unaccompanied housing under the jurisdiction of that secretary. Is this 5% requirement being met?
So we don't know, in part because the department could not figure out how to do it. That's one of our recommendations, is that the department track its funding, particularly FSRM funding for barracks. So we asked that question. We couldn't get an answer. In all likelihood, probably not, and I would encourage you to ask that at the second panel as well.
Okay, good to know. And based on your research, I'm guessing you would say it would be helpful for Congress to require DoD to disaggregate the funds so we can track this funding?
That certainly would be one way to do it. We also encourage the department to do it, even if there isn't a congressional requirement.
Thank you. I know you mentioned you visited the privatized barracks in San Diego. One of the things I hear from I represent San Diego. One of the things we hear from our folks there is that part of why they can be so much nicer is because they're doing the BAH replacement to the barracks. It's essentially fenced off funding directly for the barracks that isn't actually competing with other funding.
Right, those barracks, I believe the Pacific Beacon you're talking about, was created under a pilot that gave the Navy authority to do that full BA for that specific project.
I also want to touch on aircraft carriers, obviously representing San Diego. We have a lot of those. And I know the report detailed why living on aircraft carriers can be difficult. Can you expand on what some of these difficulties are and how they compare to the living conditions for other junior enlisted sailors?
Yeah, and in fact, I had the opportunity with my team in San Diego to tour one of the carriers that was in port and where some service members were living. It is a rough life. It is extremely noisy because they are doing maintenance on the ship when it's in port. Oftentimes, they will not have running water. Oftentimes, there might not be heat or air conditioning. We spoke with service members who were living on the ship, and they were pretty unhappy. We also toured a barge, which was not much better.
Good to know regarding the barge, because we pushed hard to try and get the barge to try and alleviate some of the carrier conditions, but it seems like that was not actually an improvement.
When you're on it, you feel like you're back on the ship, to be honest, but it does have running water and heat and air conditioning, so it's an improvement, but it's not much better.
Got it. Well, that's helpful. One of the NDA provisions that Chair Bacon and I were able to get in this year is to give commanding officers the ability to grant BAH to junior service members when they determine it's in the best interest of the member and the command. And so I'm hopeful we'll get that all the way through and at least be able to give some of our commanders a little more flexibility for our junior enlisted to be able to get into community housing when needed. The last question I have is on this oversight question. You know, GAO found that although each of the military departments is conducting inspections prior to resident occupancy, they have not developed clear or consistent inspection standards, and the military departments have not provided adequate inspector training. I know that these were recommendations from a prior GAO report. Can you provide an update on whether these recommendations have been completed?
To date, I do not believe they have been completed. We are expecting a letter from the department in, I believe, early October that would provide us an update, but thus far, no.
Okay, thank you. Well, I will look forward to this panel working to make sure that we are getting DoD to both do the disaggregated funding and spend money on barracks, but also do some of these other recommendations and track the quality of facilities in a more coherent way. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Jacobs. One of the goals in this committee is to write down recommendations to the HASC that we can put in the next NDAA. So we hope to have some strong recommendations for the committee as a whole to execute in the next defense authorization bill. There's another Don in the room. I'd like to recognize Mr. Davis from North Carolina.
Thanks so much, Mrs. Chair. And thank you, Director Phil, for being here today. I want to start by saying I associate with earlier comments that we must be focused on winning the fight. But as the chair also indicated, leaders, if they're focused on winning the fight, understand you have to take care of your people. That's the bottom line. So thank you, Mr. Chair. And that leads me into just wanting to have a greater understanding of the comment that I heard earlier when I believe I heard there was a lack of knowledge, of understanding of the conditions that was actually taking place on the barrack. Could you please shine some light on this?
So each facility is given a condition score between 0 and 100, as I noted. What we found when we went out to installations is that those scores are really unreliable. So for example, we went to a facility in the DC area that had a score of 86 out of 100, which sounds pretty good. that facility had a quarter of its air conditioning broken. So a quarter of residents had no air conditioning, and yet it still had an 86. And this happened again and again where we would go to installations and the scores just did not make sense. We tried to figure out what's going on. Why is this a problem? And we identified a few issues. One, the frequency of assessments was likely not enough. Right now, the DoD standard is every 5 years. Consistently, installation commanders told us 5 years is not frequent enough. And in some cases, they weren't even doing them that frequently, so that's a problem. Another one is the number of systems that they're assessing. There are 13 building systems that they're supposed to be assessing. In some cases, they don't always do that. Another is the training of the inspectors. They may not have training. There's no standard right now. Some services, like the Air Force, do have standard. They hire personnel with expertise to do the inspections. Some services do not. Some take a centralized model where the same team will go out and inspect various barracks across the services. Others have a decentralized model. So we have a recommendation to DoD to reassess everything from requirements for frequency to standards to inspector training.
Mm-hmm. And I would follow up on that by simply saying, so even if we throw all the money at it, but we still never keep up, there's no consistency on how we're assessing the situation, how does that help us?
That's right. That's why so many of our recommendations are toward getting greater consistency across the department and better information, because I think there always will be resource limitations, but if you have better information, you can make smarter, more targeted decisions.
Let me ask another question. We're talking about readiness. This has come up several times, and without any doubt, in I think anyone's mind that's thinking about this, because this is so unacceptable, there must be an impact, but clearly data's all over the place. But was there any data that exists whatsoever that would really help us understand how this is impacting us from a readiness perspective?
Data, no, I wish there were, but certainly that is something that we heard about. I'll just give you two examples. We heard from residents of barracks that because they are so uncomfortable in their barracks rooms, they have a hard time sleeping, they're tired on the job, they don't feel like they can perform and focus on the work that they have to do. We also heard from first sergeants who are responsible for training these junior enlisted service members, and they say, they told us specifically that sometimes they take it easier on them in training. They will cut back the length of runs or the specific drills they're going to put their service members through because they know they're going home to the barracks at night. So clear readiness implications there.
The last thing I would like to raise, which really resonated to me because it's connected to readiness as well, is specifically talking about the concerns around nutrition. Could you address that just a little bit more? Because this is not just a matter of not having access to certain, accommodations in a room, but I think there's a broader readiness part of this, if you could speak towards this.
Absolutely, and I should note we have an audit ongoing right now looking at food and nutrition more broadly, and that report will be coming out early next year. In terms of the barracks, it was one of the most common complaints that we heard. It actually surprised us how often it came up. Service members do want to be able to cook for themselves. One first sergeant told us that when he moved out of the barracks and could finally cook for himself, he lost 20 pounds because he was able to cook for himself. Access to the dining facilities is part of it. So sometimes if you're working a night shift, you don't have necessarily access to the DFAC when you need it because you're sleeping during the day and it can be hard. Walking distance to the DFAC can also be an issue, operating hours of a DFAC. So a lot of issues there, and we look forward to reporting out on that.
Thank you. Yield back.
I want to take a moment to say thank you for your testimony today, but also to the GAO for what they did. I think you've highlighted something that this committee knows we got to focus on, and I think the moms and dads all over this country appreciate this because we'll make things better for their sons and daughters and those who defend our country. And some of my key takeaways here is this isn't just a money problem, which it is, and we need to know definitively what is it going to cost to get this right. But it's also policy, accountability. So there's a whole, I guess, smorgasbord of stuff that we need to work on here. It's just not money. So thank you so much. We appreciate your time. With that, we're going to go into about a 2 or 3 minute recess. We're going to switch to panel 2, and we'll come back in about 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, about ready to start? Okay, I want to welcome our second panel and our witnesses. Thank you for being here. We have Ms. Carla Colson, Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Installations, Housing, and Partnerships. Mr. Robert Thompson, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy, Installations, and Environment. And Mr. Robert Moriarty, Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Installations and someone I served with back at Ramstein. Each witness will have the opportunity to present his or her testimony, and each member will have an opportunity to question the witnesses for 5 minutes. Your written comments and statements will be made part of the hearing record. And with that, Ms. Colson, you may make your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Bacon. I think Congresswoman Escobar isn't here, but thank you also to the distinguished members of the House Armed Services Committee Quality of Life panel. Thank you for inviting us here today to testify on the Army's unaccompanied and privatized family housing programs. As the Army's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Installations, Housing, and Partnerships, I hope to have the opportunity to share with you the Army's progress, objectives, goals, challenges, and focus on these very essential programs. Quality of life, and in particular, the opportunity for all soldiers and their families to live in safe, adequate, quality housing remains at the very top of the Army senior leader priorities, as it has been for a number of years now. Army leadership remains steadfast and purposefully committed to improving the Army's housing posture, fully recognizing the linkage between the quality of our housing and our ability to recruit and retain a ready force. Our commitment is evidenced by our continued, what we believe to be high investments in unaccompanied housing and in the owned government Army housing inventory, which is mostly located overseas, as well as our continued focus on improving oversight of operation of our privatized housing portfolio. Under the Army's leadership and direction, we have made great strides in executing privatized housing-related actions directed by several NDAAs, beginning with the military housing privatization reform of 2020. And we have also implemented dozens of recommendations made by the GAO, the DoD and Army Inspectors General, the Army Audit Agency, as well as an independent third-party auditor that we hire annually to review 20% of our privatized housing projects. The Army is proud to fully implement the Tenant Bill of Rights in September of 2021. This was a foundational step towards reestablishing trust with our families. And the Army has also included the provisions of the fiscal year 2020 NDAA reforms in our ground lease template. This template is the foundational legal document that governs our privatized housing projects. All new or modified Army ground leases will contain statutory language that further help to strengthen project-level oversight. Although we have made great strides in improving the privatized housing program, we must build on our progress. We very much appreciate and have carefully considered the GAO's recent reports and have moved immediately to address the report's recommendations. Our focus going forward is to continue to provide soldiers and their families with safe, quality, and habitable housing, while also continuing ever-vigilant oversight of the privatized housing program through enforcing standards, holding providers accountable, and ensuring long-term project sustainability and financial viability. The Army is also fully committed to improving soldier quality of life by addressing deferred maintenance and underinvestment in unaccompanied housing that was referred to in the previous panel. Even before GAO issued its initial report, and we had seen the draft earlier this year, in the fall of 2022, the Army took the unprecedented step of inspecting every room in every barracks building, of which there are over 6,700 buildings, to remedy life, health, and safety issues identified. Going forward, we are committing to spending at least $1 billion a year to improve barracks across the Army. We have also developed an in-depth barracks resourcing strategy that I think was the #1 recommendation from Ms. Field. And this takes a holistic approach for improving single soldier living conditions. Recommendations from the recently released GAO report on military barracks will assist us in further refining our focus as we continue to work initiatives to improve housing conditions for our single junior enlisted population. We are also very conscious of the need to address the requirements of our reserve components. A primary concern for both the Army Guard and Reserve is their ability to replace poor and failing training barracks inventories, where the average age of this inventory is more than 50 years. Both components anticipate increasing barracks deficits, space deficits, as these older facilities become uninhabitable. We look forward to working productively with this panel, with the readiness subcommittees of the Armed Services Committees to improve the quality of life for our treasured soldiers and their families. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Now recognize Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Chairman Bacon, distinguished members of the panel. Thanks for inviting me here today to testify on the Department of the Navy's unaccompanied housing and privatized family housing. First, I'd like to thank the Government Accountability Office for its attention and focus in these areas, for its recommendations on how we can improve the Department of the Navy's unaccompanied housing portfolio in this report, for their previous and continued work on military housing privatization, and for Ms. Field's testimony here today. I'm proud to have served more than 20 years in the United States Navy, both enlisted and later as an officer. And I'm humbled to have the privilege to continue to serve sailors, Marines, and their families in my current capacity. I've lived aboard ships, in berthing barges, in barracks, and in family housing. Quality of service, both the quality of work environment for our sailors and Marines and the quality of life that our service members deserve, are a personal issue for me. While the Department has made meaningful, tangible progress in improving the quality and livability in our privatized housing, thanks in part to GAO highlighting those issues years ago, it's clear today we have significant work ahead in our unaccompanied housing to provide safe, clean, reliable, comfortable, and dignified places for our sailors and Marines to call home. We'd expect nothing less for ourselves, and I expect nothing less from myself. I'd like to thank Congress and each member of this panel for your resolute support of our service members, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Now recognize Mr. Moriarty.
Thank you, Chairman Bacon and distinguished members. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Department of the Air Force's Military Housing Privatization Initiative, or MHPI program. I lived in 5 different government-owned homes during my 28-year military career, all been torn down and replaced. I left my family twice during deployments there, and so I understand how important housing is for our members, especially when deployed and your loved ones are back home. I came back to federal service to serve our nation and view my responsibility to take care of our members and their families as a sacred trust. Taking care of our airmen, guardians, and their families is a fundamental responsibility and commitment of the entire Department of the Air Force. Our ability to provide safe and habitable housing for our members is a critical component of their quality of life and greatly impacts our ability to recruit and retain the people we need to lead the department and accelerate the transformation our Secretary has us on to meet our pacing challenge. While we have made significant changes and improvements in our privatized housing, we continually evaluate the oversight and needs of our airmen, guardians, and their families to update our policies and take action accordingly. We empower our tenants and commanders to address housing challenges at our installations when needed and take action to hold our privatized housing project owners accountable. Additionally, we exercise senior-level governance and program oversight to provide housing for our members, housing they deserve. We continue our efforts to improve our privatized housing portfolio to implement the most recent actions, audit actions that the GAO identified. And I too would like to thank the GAO for their continued partnership. I think in MHPI, the improvements we made in large part due to their first report, the second report, I'm glad to see they recognize some of the improvements, but that there is still work to do. I also thank them for their recent report on the unaccompanied dormitories that we have and our training dorms, because that too is an area, as clearly dictated earlier, that we need to focus on. Similarly, we thank the House Armed Services Committee for the MHPI reforms set forth in the 2020 through 23 National Defense Authorization Act. We've made significant progress to implement reforms and enhance our oversight and hold our MHPI companies accountable. But as I have outlined in my written testimony, we still have more to do. We continue to maintain resident councils to foster communication between residents, installation, and project owner leadership, and we use that feedback for action plans to improve resident experiences. Clearly, we can apply those same techniques to our dormitories and tech training dorms. We also need to ensure that our projects remain financially viable. As was mentioned earlier by the GAO, that continues to be a concern. And we also continue to work with communities. 80% of our members live off the installations, thereabouts, and so we need to continue to work with those communities to provide safe, affordable housing for our members. In conclusion, I would like to communicate that the Department of the Air Force is committed to providing safe and habitable housing for our airmen, guardians, and their families, and our unaccompanied airmen living in our dorms. Our leaders are fully engaged, and only through partnership with our privatized owners, local communities, and installations can we effectively achieve that end. Look forward to working with you on our mutual goal to address quality of life for our members, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I want to put a little more emphasis on military housing, but before I do that, I'd like you to each maybe address the unaccompanied housing. The report from the GAO was appalling. How did we get there? Who was responsible? What happened? I'll start off with Ms. Colson.
Thank you for your question, Chairman Bacon. I have been working this portfolio for a very long period of time now, and I think it's through many years of not looking closely at the deferred maintenance, at investments, and so now we are in effect playing catch up. And this is not, the report frankly was not news to the Army. We're well aware, and our leadership from our secretary, our chief of staff on down are focusing very clearly on quality of life, and barracks is a piece of that. We've done a lot of work already, and I know that you've probably heard the testimony previously. We have, over the last several years, committed more than $1 billion a year. We've done a barracks resourcing strategy. So we're looking at how do we spend our dollars in the most effective manner. When you see our budget that comes over in February, I believe you'll see a multi-year investment strategy that looks at providing additional sustainment dollars. As Ms. Field pointed out, we need to sustain the inventory we have. Just as an example, we've got in the Army, through our modeling efforts, we can see that we have 300 permanent party barracks buildings that are in poor and failing shape. Across our fiscal year defense program from 24 to 28, we can address 113 of those barracks buildings. But at the same time, if we don't fully sustain, we'll have 110 existing barracks buildings that will move from good or adequate into the poor and failing category. So we don't make much progress unless we can ensure that we are doing preventative maintenance and fully sustaining our inventory.
I'll just point out, though, again, we've taken the services budgets, we've added to it. So there is a disconnect here between each service's budget requests, and we're adding to it, and yet it's been not been enough. So it doesn't add up, it would be my point. But Mr. Thompson.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I'll go back to Ms. Field's testimony. I can't speak to leadership decisions in the past. I've been blessed to be in this position for 9 months now in an acting and now full-time capacity. So I'll go back to Ms. Field's comments. I think there needs to be a realization that we are approaching kind of facility criticality maybe from the wrong angle in the department. We have typically looked at mission-critical facilities, and in resource-constrained environments, the bias is to put resources towards the most critical installation facilities. The reality is the introduction of a single sailor service member into a facility makes it by definition mission critical. The fact that these are their homes makes it mission critical. So in a resource-constrained environment, I think our overall approach to how to apply resources, those that we apply ourselves, those that the Congress thankfully has helped us with, there needs to be a clean-eyed look at that. The second part is standards that Ms. Fields hit on. Yeah, there are 13 technical standards. Sometimes we use all 13, sometimes we use 10, 9, et cetera. This is a conversation we've just started with OSD since the GAO report came out. You know, there needs to be a standard for livability, right? There needs to be a plain-eyed, clear-eyed view of what the standard is for this place to be dignified, safe, and comfortable. So I do think we have taken our expertise in facilities, just moved it right on over into essentially barracks, and then we expect that to serve us well there. And again, even if we trained everyone, even if we had consistency in application, I think we're still missing something there in terms of the fundamental technical.
I got about a minute left. I just want to let
Yes, sir.
Mr. Moriarty also speak, and I'll yield.
Chairman
Yes,
Bacon,
Mr.
I'll go quickly. I think the Air Force, we did lose the bubble. We used to have a dorm focus fund when you and I served in USAFE. We went away from that, and when we centralized a lot of our installation management, when we put all the money together, we went to a worse first, or then went to a condition-based thing and prioritized everything together, looking at the best. We've gone back now, back to the past, and we now have a focus fund, if you will, where we set aside the amount of funds we think we need to keep the dorms good and accelerate that. So they do compete within there from the top line, but then they compete amongst themselves, so we can target our investments at our worst dorms first and where it's needed in the portfolio. So I'll keep it at that, Mr. Chair, and come back.
I just want to, when I was the commander at these two installations, I had 4 stars walking around our dorms. If I would have had it that way, I would have got fired. I just don't understand what happened over 10 years, 12 years, that where this fell off the radar. And we got to put it back on the radar, and it's mission critical and essential. But with that, I got recognizing Ms. Jacobs, who's serving as the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here. First, I wanted to actually follow up on a question I'd asked Ms. Field. Why was GAO unable to find out if the services were meeting the 5% requirement of using FSRM for barracks?
I'll go. I took a note to myself. We definitively within the Department of the Navy know that we are meeting the 5% minimum investment floor of the plant replacement value for the facilities. I think Navy and Marine Corps combined, that's a little over $360 million, admittedly modestly above the 5% floor. So that information is available strictly from a restoration, modernization, and sustainment perspective. And so how that wasn't made available through the department and to Ms. Fields, I'll take that for action.
And I agree. We also have done our homework and our calculations. And I think there was, between the military departments, a little bit of a difference of opinion on how we define plant replacement value. I don't know that we ever came to any conclusion, but the Army feels also that we have met that requirement and have provided that information to OSD. Thank you, Ms. Jacobs.
Okay, thank you. And, you know, one of the things we hear is that part of the problem is that this funding is competing against other FSRM funding. Would it be helpful if Congress mandated this funding be fenced off only for barracks? Or I guess, why has the department been unable to actually just do that themselves?
Yeah, I would start with, for the Department of Defense, personally and professionally, I like the flexibility within the O&M account to be able to lean into barracks when we want to. I don't think it would help us to put it in, like, say, the housing account where that's also restricted and it's competing against housing. I think leaving it where it is allows us the flexibility within the departments to do that. There may be difference of opinion in the department, but I think for max flexibility for us, we like that. And I'd just like to say that we do know what our 5% floor is. We are meeting that within the Air Force.
Okay, well, we all like flexibility, but I think we're clearly seeing that the barracks are not being invested in, so maybe flexibility is not the only priority here.
Thank you for that question. I do have a couple of comments. As I had alluded to, we're looking at how we might fund sustainment in the future. Should we go to a higher percentage, we will definitely issue guidance to the field that tells them how to spend those dollars. I also would like to say that within our program, you might not see a lot of projects that are military construction projects for barracks. We primarily use MILCON for deficit for additional spaces that we need for things like stationing actions. But I will say that about 75% of our restoration and modernization program is already dedicated to barracks. As a matter of fact, if you talk with the Army G3, their concern would be more along the lines of having dollars available to take care of readiness facilities. So it is very much a balance, and how we work within, in my case, the Army, to ensure that we are able to balance quality of life requirements with those with modernization as well as readiness. But we already have a significant contribution to quality of life for barracks.
Yeah, Congressman, I'll go quickly. To your point, flexibility to do what, right? Flexibility to run barracks that result in what the GAO found. So I think the threshold or a floor that the Congress has put in place is helpful. My personal experience has been that absolute fencing can be problematic, not from a decision space perspective, but I think folks kind of back off of fenced accounts and don't challenge themselves or assumptions with what's in those appropriations. And lastly, to the point about privatized barracks, you know, that essentially commits us to a should fund for what right looks like, and by definition becomes a must fund in the MILPERS accounts, which produces the outcomes that Ms. Field saw in the privatized barracks.
Thank you. And really quickly with my last 40 seconds, Mr. Thompson, I know the Navy has a process in which you issue letters of concern to housing partners. How many of these letters have been issued, and have any of them resulted in cure notices or defaults? And Mr. Chair, I'd like to enter into the record 2 articles about some of the issues we're having in San Diego following more than 50 lawsuits taken up by military families.
Without objection, so ordered.
Yeah, Congresswoman, I'll answer quickly. To my knowledge, there has been 1 such letter of caution issued to date, and I am not aware of a removal action based on it.
Thank you, Ms. Jacobs. I recognize Ms. Kiggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to ask a couple more questions about the privatized family housing and just reading the GAO report. So we have 99% of our family housing is now privatized. So we're almost all the way there. So it's come a long way. And what were the biggest challenges of implementation when we made that decision of we're going to go privatized? I think it's been a work in progress, and I've only been here a limited time really paying attention. But what did that look like, that transformation?
I'll jump in, Congresswoman, and go first. It was a long time ago for the Army. Our projects are now approaching 20, 25, even 30 years in length. And our oldest project is Fort Carson. But the transition goes along the lines of moving an owned inventory to privatized housing provider, putting in place a ground lease. Some of those original ground leases that we have still exist. So we are just now in the process of looking at changing the ground leases to include the statutory guidance that was provided back in 2020 to include things like enforcement provisions, as well as things like the Davis-Bacon Act provisions. So we're looking now at strengthening these ground leases. We have learned a lot in the last 25 years. Mm-hmm. We've learned, for example, that perhaps we didn't get it right in the beginning with respect to the amount of equity that we put into these projects. Mm-hmm. And our projects are structured all a little bit differently. Ours are more similar than the Air Force. But we did, in the very beginning, attempt to provide an inventory to that provider that was a healthy inventory. However, we have 19,000 legacy homes that are older housing stock that are still out there that we need to take a look at how we renovate, how we recapitalize. I'll turn this over to you.
Yeah, I'll go quickly. I think consistent with what Ms. Colson said, I think the first period was marked with the actual effort of taking the government-owned inventory, getting the land leases done, essentially a significant recapitalization effort of those houses. I'll go back to the GAO reports. I think what we found was once that effort was done and they were now in the hands of the private companies, there was almost a sentiment that they had been outsourced at that point, and hence maybe the lack of oversight that was required. And again, GAO highlighted that several years ago, and I think we'll talk today about much of the progress we've made since then. I do just want to offer, as we talk about privatized housing and then the possibility of privatized barracks, that we've learned lessons about not disconnecting and maintaining our oversight and accountability. I think we apply those today in the unaccompanied barracks. And I think the scale is a completely different issue as well, several tens of thousands of homes versus currently 4 buildings and ideally a lot more.
Yeah, great.
Thank you, ma'am.
Congressman, I'd say that our later projects, we applied the lessons that we learned on our earlier ones. We did it over a decade span or so. And the problems that we're having now financially with our projects are the earlier projects where they were just poorer deals for a bunch of reasons. I think a lot of the lessons we learned could be applied to any future privatization. I would agree with him that, you know, when you privatize, I think commanders took the eye off the ball. We've worked to strengthen our commander involvement, and to Chairman Bacon's point, we have a 4-star twice-a-year gathering where we have a housing council at the 4-star level with them looking at it. We have a 2-star level. We also empower our installation commanders through training. We give them what we call an HP 101, and we hold them accountable. I think for the most part, commanders felt like it wasn't commanders' business anymore, and that was made clear in the 2018-2019 business. So, you know, what did we learn? We learned that, you know, by financially financing these things doesn't mean you can walk away from the deals. You still have a part.
And also reading the GAO report, it seems there's 14 private housing companies then that provide this privatized family housing. Does that work okay? Is it disjointed at all? Is there enough standardization? Is that a good model where we have lots of different companies doing different things? Or because I just want to take our lessons learned from this decade that we've learned good things and apply it to unaccompanied housing and how we can, you know, if we do go that route, implement it correctly.
I think there's more standardization now than there was previously. There is an organization, the Military Housing Association, that tries to pull these providers together and get them to see things the same way. We're working right now on a quality assurance, quality control plan. They are with us to use across our 6. The Army's got 6 providers. So we are looking. It is important to standardize, and we're looking to do that in a better way. And I think the legislation from 2020 on has helped.
Good.
Thank you, Ms. Higgins. I recognize Ms. Strickland from Washington State.
Thank you. And Ms. Jacobs pointed out to me that our 2 Dons are Don Davis and Don Bacon, Davis Bacon. So thank you to our witnesses for being here today, and I especially want to thank Ms. Colson. You have been so accessible with my office and my staff for the issues on JBLM, so I want to commend you for your leadership and just always having an open door and being there for us. So I want to talk a bit about being creative and how we address the housing supply. So regarding solutions to addressing the housing backlog at Joint Base Lewis McChord, I think that creativity is important here, and one idea that I'm starting to hear about is the enhanced use lease. So if you could, number one, explain in layman's terms what that means, and then really answer the question, if the garrison identified some land for an enhanced use lease for housing development, is it required for the military housing provider to develop the project, or can another private developer use that lease?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman Strickland, and I enjoy working with your staff as well, very much. I would like to talk about EULs. We have never used an enhanced use lease for housing.
Okay.
But we have, it's a real estate, the statute is 10 USC 2667. It's a real estate statute. We have, if we've got property that is not excess to a military department, to the Army, but we don't have necessarily immediate use for it, we can use that property for other purposes. So we have to take a look at that property. We have to understand the environmental condition of the property. We would have to comply with NEPA, and then we would look at what we might be able to use that for. It is not necessary that we would use the privatized housing provider that serves JBLM at this moment. We would compete, we'd be able to compete for the use of that property, and then we would receive in-kind consideration for the use as part of an enhanced use lease. So that's the way it works. We do have several. The Air Force has many, and may be able to help inform this discussion. If you've got any other questions, I'd be happy to sit down with your staff and run through this with them.
All right. Well, Mr. Moriarty, can you talk a bit about what the Air Force is doing and how that's worked out?
Yes, ma'am. So typically, you're right. Typically, our clauses say we don't compete with them. But in a market like that, it would work. We have enhanced use leases like down at Eglin where we have mixed use. So we might have apartments on top, development. We're working one right now in F.E. Warren. Will be another mixed use. It's in the process of negotiations, but that would produce housing. The win there is while we're not involved in who gets assigned there and how it works, it would be a market-driven rent, right? But it helps in those communities too, where especially at F.E. Warren, where they lack available affordable housing. It's a win-win for the community and it. And so I'd be glad to share more information as you'd like, ma'am. But that is a possibility to increase housing availability where there's a developer that can do it. Most of the time what we found at Altus Air Force Base is where the state and the city put money aside for developers. They've been able to create affordable housing that our airmen would want to live in,
Yep.
but they had to put money into it to make that development happen. That wasn't on our land, but it's similar to what you're talking about of, in most of these deals, we can offer land, we have to get fair market value,
Yep.
and we have to compete it, but that's not a very high bar, quite frankly. A lot of our land where we are, unlike the Navy, is not what I would call expensive land in those areas comparatively. Over.
No, great, and I love the, as a former mayor, I love the idea of mixed use because you're often building housing and then you're building amenities with it as well, so it improves the quality of life. So our office is definitely interested in learning more about that, and thank you for your testimony. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Strickland. Recognize now Mr. Alford from Missouri.
Thank you, General Bacon. I just want to say, first off, how much I am honored to be on this panel. I just think this is long overdue, and I'm not a veteran, but I've been to Fort Leonard Wood. I've seen the barracks there. I've seen the issues. Ms. Coulson and I talked about this yesterday on the phone. We've got to get this right. You know, I don't know about you, General Bacon, but I have constituents calling me now. It's like, we're heading towards a shutdown. Our military's not going to get paid, but we're still going to fund and pay the Ukrainian military. And this report comes out with the GAO this week with these horrible pictures of living conditions that our servicemen and women are living in. It's just not right. And I'm so glad that we are concentrating on bringing up this quality of life so we can instill pride once again in our military and boost our recruitment numbers. So thank you all for being here today. I want to wrap my head around something because I noticed the 21 NDAA housing reform provisions, Section 2818, requires the Department to expand the Uniform Code of Basic Standards for privatized military housing. I'm proud to say that we worked with Senator Hawley's office in getting $50 million for Fort Leonard Wood for privatized housing. There are some very big needs there. And as you know, that base trains 80,000 personnel a year. So it's very important for these families to have some sense of pride in where they live. We're not building the Taj Mahal, but we're building a nice place where families can have each other over and invest in community with one another. Is there not a standard for barracks right now, Ms. Coulson?
We do have standards. All of us have standards. Our standards may be different, however.
Why? Why are there different standards?
Well, I think left to our own devices, Congressman Alford, we'll do what we feel is best for our military department. And I'll give you an example. We've just established a new construction standard. That is great. It's 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a full kitchen, a full living room. I don't know what the construction standards are for the Air Force and the Navy, my counterparts, but this is a decision that Army leadership made, and we would like to be able to provide that level of standard to our soldiers, our single soldiers. So we all have standards, and we can sit down and talk about what our standards are. I think that there is, the HASC-R is undertaking a look during this NDA that's being discussed right now at asking us to standardize across the military departments. I am an advocate for that.
I would like to see that as well. You say we need, or you need $1 billion a year to get this right. How many total buildings are we talking about? You said 6,700. Is that the total number of barracks there are in the DoD?
So for the Army, and I can only speak for the Army,
Okay.
it's a matter of scale. I think the memo that you received last night said there were 9,000 barracks buildings. The Army has 6,700 of them.
Okay.
And 3,900 are training, and the rest are permanent.
So of those 6,700, what percentage is not up to a standard that you would want to live in?
We consider 23% of that number to be in poor and failing condition.
And currently, there are service members living in 23% of these 6,700 barracks that are below standard.
I don't know that they are livable or habitable, and many are collective training. The ones that, well, Representative Escobar is not here, but those that she talked about, for example, at Fort Bliss, that are used by the Army Guard, the Army Reserve during annual training. So for permanent party, if I can just talk about that, the number is smaller. It's 18% of our permanent party barracks are in poor and failing.
So at $1 billion a year, if we came up with this money, how long would it take, considering the deferred maintenance on these other buildings, we're going to dip down into the substandard category, how long will it take to right the ship?
Well, we already spend over $1 billion a year on our barracks. When we looked at, and this is data from modeling, when we looked at what it would cost to recapitalize our permanent party inventory that I just described, the bill for that inventory alone is $6.5 billion in addition to what we're already.
I'm almost out of time. At the rate of $1 billion a year, how long would it take to right the ship, to get it right? No substandard housing.
So we look across the POM 25, 29, it would take about an additional $6.5 billion, and that's just from a modeled number to be able to restore and modernize our inventory to 100%.
I've gone over. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Alford. We only have the room for about 5 more minutes, so I'll try to wrap up. But I just saw the headline just came out from Stars and Stripes. Sewage, rats, and crime. Our service members deserve better. Not good. And I hope our service chiefs are taking this personally. They need to. To me, it's a leadership problem and a funding problem. I get that. We're part of the solution here, but it's unacceptable to have that kind of headline. That's what our people are reading today, all over the country. I got a request, but not to be answered today. I would love to sit down with whoever the experts are to understand how do we determine housing allowance. I've had more feedback from people that's a mystery. You know, it sounds like some people are super calculators behind a closed door, and it seems like it works in some of our areas, but other areas it appears to be woefully underestimated, like in Washington, D.C. area, as an example. I've heard the same in Hawaii and San Diego. So I'd love just to understand it better to see if we can put a better oversight on that or not. I just don't know if there's an issue there. And maybe one last question for me. How would each of you describe, if you do it briefly, characterize the financial health of your housing, military housing projects? For how many of them you've had to refinance by bringing in additional funding? If you just give us a little sense how each service is doing there, I'd be grateful.
Yes, Chairman. For the Department of the Navy, I think our overall financial health across the partners is healthy. We do have a few challenge projects, particularly our Marine Corps projects down in the Carolinas, largely as a result of Hurricane Florence and some of the effect on the inventory there and occupancy. So, but the bottom line is we've had none that have gone to refinancing or restructuring.
Thank you.
Just very quickly, I think we are happy with the short-term financial viability of our projects. It's the long term. It's what do we do over the next 25 years to address the needed recapitalization of our privatized inventory that we struggle with.
We welcome your feedback and how we can assist there. That's another area that we got to look at. Mr. Moriarty.
Sir, every year we do a financial check of our projects. Based on this year's with the bar rates and costs and all, 12 of our 31 projects are going to require some kind of restructure. We have put money in starting in 22 in our budgets to get after those so that we can have good debt coverage, 100% sustainment, and at least 70% reinvestment. There are some things at campus we'd love to talk to you more about. Scoring was mentioned earlier. There's also other restrictions in law that allow us to put even more money to fix those projects. projects. Last thing I'd leave you with, Mr. Chairman, and for distinguished congressmen and women is, for the Air Force, none of our members should be living in a room that is substandard. We have a smaller problem. We only have about 800 between our tech and our numbers are smaller, but none of our airmen or guardians should be living in a room. Every commander has the ability and responsibility to move that airman out of that room or guardian if it's a problem. We have dorms that need work and need money, but there never is an excuse. From the Air Force side, our leadership, from the Secretary to our two chiefs, would not allow that. So our installation leadership should know that. I just want to leave that with you, that has not changed in our Air Force.
Well, we appreciate you being here today and taking our questions and giving us feedback. When we started this, my assumption was that we were going to hear primarily about the 15% or so of our military that could qualify for SNAP, food insecure. So when we were going to bases, I expected that to be where I would hear the most concerns, and actually it was about housing. I've heard more from our military members and spouses, or the family members. It's been more about the housing, the quality of housing, the housing allowance if they're living off base. And so I've become educated and informed by the feedback of those on the ground and what they're going through. And it appears to me that Congress has an important role here. With the military housing, it was our injects that helped do a course correction here. I think we're going to have to do the same thing when it comes to our barracks. So we're going to put a focus on this. We're going to put a spotlight on it, but the services also got to tell us what they need to under budget, and those put more in than requested and still have a deficit. There's something not right there. It does not add up. So there is an urgent need for duty to implement oversight of our housing to right now primarily our unaccompanied housing, and continue steadfastly in their mission to ensure military families and privatized housing are taken care of. So with that, thank you for your time, and thanks to our fellow members here. With that, we will close the hearing. Thank you.